They say every story has an ending, but some stories refuse to die. They linger, creeping into the minds of those who hear them, twisting reality until fiction and truth become one. This is one such story, and now you are part of it. It all began with Asher, a writer obsessed with horror. He had spent years searching for a tale that could truly terrify, something no one could forget. His journey led him to an old bookstore, hidden deep in an alley no one seemed to notice. The shopkeeper was an old man with hollow eyes. He didn't speak, just pointed to a dusty shelf in the back. That's where Asher found it, an untitled manuscript, its pages stained and brittle. There was no author's name, no publication date, just words scrawled in jagged ink. Whoever reads these words invites the endless horror into their life. Asher smirked. A curse? How predictable. He had read dozens of urban legends, but he was desperate for inspiration, so he read on. As the words unfolded, something strange happened. The story began to describe his exact actions, the way he ran his fingers through his hair, the way his foot tapped against the wooden floor. And then his name appeared. Asher lifted his head, realizing he was no longer alone. A chill crawled up his spine. He glanced around the empty bookstore. The shopkeeper was gone. The air had grown thick, heavy, as if something unseen was pressing against him. He shut the manuscript, but the words were burned into his mind. That night, the nightmares began. He dreamt of dark corridors that stretched endlessly, of whispers calling his name from behind locked doors. He woke up gasping, sweat dripping down his face. His phone buzzed. A new message, no number, no name. Keep reading. He checked his desk. The manuscript was there, though he had left it at the bookstore. The pages fluttered open on their own, stopping at a new line. The longer you resist, the worse it will become. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision. He heard footsteps in his empty apartment. Objects shifted without reason. The walls started whispering, at first faint murmurs, then voices growing louder, screaming words he couldn't understand. He tried to escape. He booked a hotel in another city, but the horror followed. The manuscript appeared on the nightstand, no matter where he went. The same message flashed on his phone. Keep reading. Asher wasn't the only one affected. His best friend Mark came to check on him. The moment Mark touched the manuscript, he froze. His pupils dilated. He whispered one sentence before collapsing. "It's watching me." Mark was never seen again. No missing person reports, no records, as if he had never existed. Asher's world unraveled. His reflection no longer copied his movements. The whispers now spoke in his voice. One night, he woke to the sound of his own typing, his fingers moving against his will, writing new pages of the manuscript. The story wasn't finished. It was evolving, feeding. His calls for help went unanswered. His social media accounts disappeared overnight. His emails bounced back. When he visited his childhood home, his mother didn't recognize him. She looked at him with confusion and whispered, "Who are you?" That's when he realized. He was being erased. Desperate, he burned the manuscript. But as the flames consumed the pages, new ones formed. The words burned into the walls, into his skin. One final message appeared. The story doesn't end. It only spreads. He smashed his laptop, his phone, anything that could connect him to the outside world. But the story had already reached others. It had reached you. Now that you've heard it, it knows you. It watches, it waits, and soon your part in the story will begin. There are places on this earth that have been abandoned, not because of war or disaster, but because something far worse made them unlivable. Some villages fade into history, their names lost to time, their stories buried in whispers. But sometimes those stories resurface. Deep in the mountains of Eastern Europe, there was once a village named Orlov. It appeared on maps centuries ago, but one day it simply vanished. No records of destruction, no survivors, no remains. Just gone. For decades, no one spoke of Orlov. Travelers avoided its location. It became a ghost on the landscape. But in 1998, a group of university researchers discovered an old map marking its whereabouts. Driven by curiosity, they set out to find what remained. There were 7 of them. Only one returned. The survivor, Alexei Makarov, was found wandering near a highway, covered in dirt and blood, his clothes torn. He couldn't speak for days. When he finally did, his words made no sense, until authorities traced his steps back to where he had come from. There, in the mountains, they found something chilling. Orlov still existed. The village stood as if frozen in time, houses untouched, food still on tables, clothes hung on lines. But it was empty, no signs of life, no bodies, just an eerie silence. The team's equipment and supplies were there, but the others were missing. Alexei kept repeating one phrase over and over again. They never left. What happened to his team? What did they see? The truth was locked in Alexei's fractured mind, and the authorities, unwilling to chase legends, closed the case. But 25 years later, a journalist named Daniel Carter came across Alexei's story and decided to investigate. Daniel found Alexei living in a remote care facility, his eyes always fixed on the corner of the room, as if something stood there. When Daniel mentioned Orlov, Alexei grabbed his wrist with unnatural strength and whispered, "If you go, don't look at them." Daniel ignored the warning. With a group of 4 filmmakers, he journeyed to Orlov to uncover the truth. Equipped with cameras, GPS, and supplies, they arrived at the village just before dusk. Everything was exactly as described. The building stood perfectly preserved, yet untouched by time. No insects, no birds, no wind, just silence. Inside the houses, the scene was unsettling. Plates of rotted food sat on tables, but no sign of decay touched the walls or furniture. An old radio hummed with static, though it had no power source. A doll sat on a child's bed, its glass eyes reflecting something, watching. Then the sun set. It started with whispers. At first they thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. The voices weren't coming from any direction. They were all around them, circling. Then one of the team members, Rachel, screamed. She pointed to a window. Outside, barely visible in the darkness, stood a figure. No details, just a shape, still, silent, watching. The team rushed outside, but the figure was gone. They laughed it off, telling themselves it was paranoia. But Daniel noticed something horrifying on the camera. The figure hadn't disappeared. It had moved closer. They decided to leave, but as they packed, they realized something was wrong. The path they had taken into the village was gone. The GPS malfunctioned. The road leading out was now just forest. The village wouldn't let them go. That night, the whispers grew louder. Their tents shook. Heavy footsteps echoed outside. And then they saw them. Figures stood in every doorway, in every window, watching. No eyes, no faces. Just darkness where their features should be. They did not move. They did not speak. But when Daniel blinked, they were closer. Rachel panicked and ran. The others chased after her, but she was swallowed by the darkness. Her scream echoed through the village. Then silence. They searched all night, but there was no sign of her. Just her camera, lying in the middle of the street, the lens cracked. The last recording showed Rachel staring at something just beyond the frame. Then, in a whisper barely audible, she said one word. Run. Morning came, but the sky remained dark. Time didn't exist in Orlov. The village was a trap, a feeding ground for something beyond human understanding. One by one, the team vanished, until only Daniel remained. He ran through the empty streets, past the frozen houses, screaming for help. But the only response was laughter, not from the air, not from the shadows, but from his own voice, echoing back at him. Then he saw himself. Standing at the edge of the village was him, a perfect copy, smiling, beckoning, and behind it, a wall of faceless figures closing in. Daniel never escaped. His footage was found 2 years later, buried deep in an anonymous forum online. The frame, a village, silent, still, empty. But in the reflection of a window, a figure stood, watching. They say Orlov still exists, that those who search for it will always find it. But if you go, don't look at them.